All right, welcome everybody. My name is Brad Boswell. I'm a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University right now, and I have the great pleasure of talking today with Travis Proctor about his new book. It's got a nice copy here, well, it's of course getting blurred out, Demonic Bodies and the Dark Ecologies of Early Christian Culture. It's worth looking at in a non-blurred version, so look at a copy so you can see. Thanks for this book, Travis. I really enjoyed reading it, working through it, thinking about some of the questions that you raised.
Yeah, thank you, Brad, and thanks for the chance to chat with you, and thanks for everybody to tuning in. So I'm looking forward to talking about it a bit.
Great, so let's dive right in. Why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit about how this book project originated? What were your interests? What got us to this form right here?
Yeah. I think it was really an observation that I had really starting in graduate school of just how diverse of ideas Christians had about demons, early Christians especially. I noticed early on that, some authors, especially like Ignatius of Antioch, describe demons, for example, as bodiless, as kind of these ghostly figures of some sort. But then I noticed other authors, for example, like Clement of Alexandria, describing them as rather embodied, at least having a body of some kind of substance.
Right.
And emphasizing that aspect of it. And so I really wanted to understand, why are Christians disagreeing about this, or can this tell us something about Christian history and Christian culture in this period? And what I started to realize and really start to notice is that oftentimes when these disagreements were occurring, they're indicative of some things that were maybe haunting, Christians in the spirit, or things they're really trying to work through. Mm-hmm. Issues of gender, issues of religious difference, issues of proper Christian practice. And so I wanted to understand some more about how these things were occurring. And so one example that's a straightforward one that makes for a really nice contrast is Ignatius, as I said, constructs demons as these bodiless figures, and kind of explicitly says they don't have any kind of flesh like humans do.
Right.
In a direct contrast, the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter, a well-known text from Nag Hammadi, does the opposite. It actually associates demons with flesh as a way of, in this case, kind of demonizing the fleshly body in a certain kind of way. Mm-hmm. And so what I note in the chapter that discusses these two texts is that clearly demons are this way that these two authors are working through this issue that's a disagreement among Christians. That is, what's the relative value of the body for Christian practice and Christian thought and belief? And demons were a way that they're really working through this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. So you mentioned at least 2 or 3 texts just now. You've got a couple more in the book. Could you tell us a little bit about how you landed on those texts? What drew you to them, sort of other than just the fact that they've got central demonologies?
Yeah. I think there's a few things. So the book covers from 1st to the 3rd century early Christian texts, starting with the Gospel of Mark, 1st century important gospel, but otherwise covering 2nd and 3rd century kind of early patristic, early church father writers. I think a few things that drew me to them. One is that for all of these works that I cover, Gospel of Mark, Ignatius, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian of Carthage, and Justin Martyr, demons are significant. They play a major role in how these authors are really thinking through some of the issues that concern them. But what was also interesting about this period is that, as I've already hinted at, there's really no kind of demonological orthodoxy. The way that I kind of tell my students about this when I'm teaching about this period of history is that this is kind of like the Wild West of Christian theology. It's seemingly anything goes, or at least there's lots of different kind of positions floating around that Christians are trying to work through. And that certainly applies to demonology. So it got me interested in this. Clearly demons are significant for Christians to think about and through, but also they disagree on them. So why would that be? And the other reason that I think it's an important period to study is that even though we might see this diversity there, this is of course the early period when Christians are really working out what is going to be kind of our official position or a lot more widespread position on things like demons or angels. Right. So even though these Christians might not agree on these issues, they can be quite influential on some authors who have quite a bit of influence in later Christian theology and history. So I want to understand, this somewhat understudied period of early Christianity and Christian culture. How did that then have an impact and be significant for later periods as well?
Yeah. The scope of the project is a really interesting one, among other things. So I think that lays out the landscape pretty well, sort of who you've worked with and how it started. Could you summarize now for us? What are the most significant findings from what you've done?
Yeah, and some of these things I started to hint at a little bit. I think its most significant finding is, at least in what I've found, is that the demons often, ideas about demons among early Christians often had major significance for how then these Christians were constructing the human body. Mm-hmm. That is how they're thinking about what made up the human and why was that significant for early Christian practice. And so, for example, I talk about Clement of Alexandria, who portrays demons in this rather embodied way. Well, one of the things that he's really trying to emphasize is the importance of kind of stripping the body away from Christians, especially as part of ascetic practice, and especially as part of his appeals for Christians to not eat meat, as well as to avoid things like wine, for example. So this kind of embodied portrayal of demons is in one way, again, to kind of demonize those parts of the human body that Clement wants Christians to kind of strip away, or at least, let's say, demote in their thinking about Christian piety. And so therefore these demons serve him in a way that's really significant for thinking about Christian culture and the Christian body in that way.
Yeah.
Then the second major finding that the book really tries to stress is that these didn't remain theoretical debates, that in each chapter I really try to stress how these had major significance for how these authors were thinking about Christian ritual or Christian practice. And so to stay with Clement of Alexandria there, this of course informed Clement's argument that Christians, or at least, elite Christians or the most pious Christians should be vegetarians, for example. And so as that would play out, now, of course, not everyone's going to follow what these Christian authors are arguing, of course, but it does mean that as these debates about ritual practice were taking shape, demons were part of the conversation and were at least informing how Christians were thinking about how they should come to embody Christian practice.
Yeah, that's good. I think you say several times in the book that the Christian bodies were co-constituted with the demonic bodies. I found that to be an interesting way of putting it, that to understand the one, you've got to understand the other, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Could you say more about what gaps in scholarship this fills, where you situate this work with respect to what else is out there?
Yeah, so this is the first book-length work on demonic bodies in early Christianity. This is something that had been treated really well in an article, a kind of well-known article in Journal of Early Christian Studies by Gregory Smith, whose work was really informative for mine. But the first book-length, more wide-ranging treatment of this issue. And I think a second gap that it really fills in scholarship is that it's rare that you find scholarship that crosses the gap between New Testament studies and, say, in early Christian, early patristic studies especially. And so my work of treating, Gospel of Mark and then alongside these early Christian authors is really trying to bridge that gap between them. And I think there's been wonderful work on demonology on, say, ancient Judaism by Annette Yoshiko Reed, or on late antique monastic context by David Brackey, for example. And so my work is trying to maybe fill in a little bit of that gap, some authors that hadn't been treated as much by previous works on demonology, and trying to trace out how those might be important.
Great. Let me slip in a question that I'm particular, if I can. If we can go back real quick to how this originated. You mentioned that the discovery about how early demonology often overlapped with debates about things that haunted, I think was the language that you used, religious difference, gender, proper practice. I heard sort of resonances of ideology being part of what's shaping that discourse, but you also brought out a lot of other things that were maybe conditioning the discourse about demons, if I can put it that way. You've got a fair bit about how the natural philosophy was involved, and even just what materially a body is, whatever materially or physically means. We could probably think of other modes of discourse, if you will, something like that are at play. Exegetical is certainly one of them. Most of these texts are reading other texts. Could you just reflect for a minute on how you see those different layers of conditioning the discourse about demons interacting and coming together? It's a question that I sort of often wonder about, the theological dimensions, that you've got ecological dimensions. How do you see it working together and making sense of these really generative texts?
Yeah, I think it was one of those things that, even though my work is really focused on kind of how's the demonology functioning, and then maybe if we could frame it kind of in terms of like anthropology, how are constructions of humans functioning here? But then, of course, in each chapter, there are these other factors that are in play or intersecting with these, whether it's ritual practice or, as you pointed out, natural philosophy. And so maybe to stick with that example, that's one especially that comes up in the chapter on Justin Martyr, for example. Yeah. And what I note there is noting these resonances between how the demonic body is shaped by Justin and his construction of kind of the ideal human. But I note that that's, of course, not the only thing he's thinking about. And I have a section, for example, on natural philosophy. How is he thinking about God here? So I note that the language that Justin uses often emphasizes the stability and unity of God. And that's kind of his overarching theology that's really emphasized, especially throughout the Apologies. And then, as I note, is that the demonic body is portrayed in exactly the opposite way. It's portrayed in this way. It's this shifting, multiform, polymorphous entity that's always shifting. So there's this real contrast between how Justin views God and how Justin views demons. And then this, of course, then has ramifications for the anthropology, how he, constructs the ideal human, or his warnings about what humans might become if they have too close relations with these demons. So I think it's one of the real challenges of the book, or of my research as I worked through it, was I think I kept finding like, oh, well, this is significant too, as well as this, vector of influence here. How I tried to encapsulate is something that you gestured toward, which is thinking about these as kind of ecologies. These are different types of forces or entities or ideas that are taking shape alongside each other. And I thought about that in a couple different ways. One, in terms of intellectually, how are kind of ideas shaping each other as they kind of come together and co-constitute each other within the thought and writing of these authors. But then also was thinking about that in a more material or embodied way. How does, the Christian body come to take shape as part of this broader ecology of beings and ideas and practices and materialities? And so the idea of kind of thinking of the Christian body as part of a broader cosmic ecology was a way that I found a way to help me kind of pull those threads together and think about the diverse ways that these things are really informing each other.
Yeah, that's helpful. It's a testament to the book how you have so many layers going into the analysis that are each they have their own integrity in the way that you write about them, but they're clearly interconnected. I thought in really sophisticated and subtle ways.
Thank you.
So let's move maybe to a last question here, and I want to get you to talk a little bit more about the ecology side, because it's in the title, and I know you've got some really interesting and clearly stated ideas about how this relates to environmental humanities and some other fields. So to put it this way, whom do you hope will benefit from the research?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a few different areas that I hope the book contributes to and will be helpful for folks. I think, obviously for people interested in both the New Testament and early patristics, especially anyone interested in demonology or angelology, kind of the spirits of the ancient world that were impactful for Christian culture. I hope it'll be useful on those fronts. But as you noted in some of your comments and questions, there's also a kind of theoretical interest the book has and treats in the chapters, including on gender studies, disability studies, that again, I hope will provide some models for folks to think about those issues when it comes to early Christian culture. But the overarching contribution the book makes, or where it really tries to intervene, has to do with the intersections between the environmental humanities and then early Christian culture. I think one thing that hopefully reading these early Christian authors helps us reflect on is thinking about how their portrait of the human body being embedded within this broader ecology. And I think that conversation then puts these works, this ancient history, in conversation with contemporary concerns. I think a lot of folks, as we can see in religious studies, as well as in environmental studies, are interested in thinking about how have religious and cultural ideas shaped how we think about the environment, and then how does that shape how we think about ourselves and our relation to the environment. Well, I think these works and this history can give us a chance to reflect on that. How have we constructed ourselves and our bodies and our kind of cultures and in relation to the broader environment around us. And these authors provide, some interesting case studies to at least think with of some alternative constructions of the body, which perhaps can then help us think a little bit about our own case and our own relations with the natural world.
Yeah. If I could jump onto that real quick, you mentioned teaching some of this material now. I don't know if you've done a class on this precisely or just sort of the teaching from the era, but how do your students handle the material? Do you find it doing anything particularly interesting, eye-opening for them?
Yeah, I think it can be really fun. I've taught a few different classes on this front, religion, nature, and the environment, which takes a pretty broad approach, and also religion and animals, and try to incorporate, stuff on early Christianity or the ancient world as much as I can. And I think students find it really fascinating. I think it surprises them. I think hopefully what I'm able to draw out is kind of the complexity of these authors and these cultures. I think one thing that you do encounter sometimes in the environment humanities is sometimes pretty simplistic characterizations of especially pre-modern cultures and their approaches to the environment. And I hope my work, complicates that picture, that at least kind of shows that these authors, at least in Christian culture, had some complex relations with the natural world, or what they viewed as kind of the more than human world. Right. And so I've found that students can start to appreciate that. And, I don't know if it leads them to any clean solutions, but, at least it gets them thinking, hopefully in a little bit more complex ways about those issues.
Yeah, it seems like good material for expanding the imagination in those ways. Well, should I say once again, the book is Demonic Bodies and the Dark Ecologies. It's now all blurred out, isn't it? Demonic Bodies and the Dark Ecologies of Early Christian Culture. Thanks again for sharing this material with us.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brad, and thanks everybody, and hope it's helpful.